Another company, Paul, stay with us because I want to bring in another guest. Another company that made the news this week is AOL. In a meeting with approximately 1,000 workers, CEO Tim Armstrong became annoyed when one of them took photographs and he actually fired him very publicly in front of everyone. Hollywood and TV's The Apprentice suggests that all it takes for someone to lose their job is the boss to utter those dreaded words, "You're fired." But is it really as simple as that? Brendan Dillon of Dillon Solicitors. How easy is it to fire somebody, Brendan?
Well, certainly, Bobby, if you were to take Tim Armstrong's lead, I think you'd find yourself as an employer paying out a lot of money to a disgruntled employee. I suppose, in summary, the main piece of legislation which governs dismissal law in Ireland goes back actually to 1977, our Unfair Dismissals Act, and that really provides that an employer should have substantial grounds for the reason to dismiss an employee, but more particularly that he should apply fair procedures. And it's interesting to note that it's estimated that in cases where employees successfully bring cases to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, that in about 80% of those cases they are won not because the employer didn't have substantial grounds, but because the employer didn't adhere to fair procedures.
Brendan, can I just say to you, I've employed many people over the years, and I've often had the very unpleasant task of having to fire somebody. And maybe I could just differentiate for you between actually firing somebody that you find with their hand in the till, somebody who's been dishonest, and there's an impulsiveness around if you see something that's a dismissible offence and you say, right, that guy's, I saw him put €10 in his back pocket, I'm going to fire him. And the trick really is not to be impulsive, is it not? And the natural reaction is if you see somebody doing something dishonest in your business, out the door. But that's not the way it works.
No, and you're absolutely right, Bobby. There are very often cases where it's quite obvious that an employer will not have employed fair procedures, but many people think that if they catch somebody with their hand in the till, it's an open and shut case and out the door, and you can't have them on the premises. But from an employer's point of view, it's very important to remember that even though it may seem obvious, the employee in question is still entitled to the benefit of the doubt. There needs to be an investigation as to the actual facts of what happened. The employee needs to be given information of the charge alleged against the employee. The employee should be told that the possible sanction, if the investigation is found to be against him, that dismissal is the likely outcome, and the employee should be given the opportunity of representation. And for a lot of employers that might seem completely over the top, but the reality of our employment legislation is that if an employer simply fires somebody, he could find himself, or she indeed could find himself, the subject matter of a claim that could go against him.
And you're saying that 8 out of 10 that actually end up in courts are won by the employees?
Well, what I'm saying is that 80% of the cases that are won on procedural grounds.
Right, okay.
So they could include cases where actually the employer had a very good reason to dismiss the employee, but didn't follow fair procedures. And very often, Bobby, it's the case that they actually don't follow their own procedures. So they may have a handbook, the disciplinary procedures might be in contract, but they just don't follow the procedures, and that's where they get themselves tripped up.
Let me ask you another question, Brendan, around firing somebody almost by stealth. If you say you want to fire somebody and then you decide, well, I'll make him redundant, I'm really firing him, but I'm going to go down the redundancy route. That happens a lot out there in the marketplace.
It does, Bobby. It's a very good question. It's a very good point. And of course, in recent times, I suppose it's been easier for employers to get away with that because it's much more difficult for an employee to prove in the current economic circumstances that the dismissal was, if you like, by stealth, as opposed to the position simply not being filled. Obviously, if an employee is dismissed in those circumstances and the employer very shortly afterwards fills the position, then the employee would clearly have a very strong case to be able to establish that actually the employer was simply trying to get rid of him. The reality is that, I suppose from an employee point of view, if you are dismissed, you have a duty to mitigate your loss, and if an employee can get another job, which is obviously their priority, which doesn't actually lose them any money, then in effect they'll generally not take a case, because in those circumstances, an employment appeals tribunal can really only compensate for the loss of income that they've received, as opposed to kind of general damages.
Let me bring in Paul O'Dwyer. He's a clinical director with Smiles Dental, again a retail operation. Paul, what are your views on what Brendan's saying there?
I would speak not from it. Thankfully, I haven't had experience of firing anyone, but I have made people redundant in the past, particularly when I closed my own dental practice, and that's a tough thing to do, particularly for a hard-working employee that's come along. But thankfully, in my own personal experience, I've never had the opportunity or the reason to fire anyone. But I do understand how these things work, and I know that, as has just been said there, as Brendan was saying, you have to follow procedure all the way through. That seems to be the key thing. Is
that really the message in one, Brendan? Just keep cool, keep calm, and follow procedure.
Yeah, I think so, Bobby, and you were mentioning earlier about the whole empathic approach and the manner in which nobody likes doing it, and very often from the employee's point of view, what they actually want is a certain dignity being preserved in relation to how it's been done. So very often the emotional response and the very personal and possibly, if you call it vindictive manner in which employers may sometimes act, is what triggers the employee's reaction, and it triggers the employee's tendency to go and seek legal advice and say, what are my options? I think if an employer is deemed or seen to be fair, go through the procedures, and even in a difficult situation, the vast majority of employees will understand that, and also they're not going to want to incur the risk and the possible legal cost to them of bringing a claim that may be unsuccessful. All
right, Brendan Dillon, Dillon Solicitors, thanks very much for that very sanguine advice. I should have listened to it more over the years. I'd like to thank also my newspaper reviewer, Paul O'Dwyer from Smiles Dental.